I found myself sitting next to a strange boy on my first day of middle school. As the teacher droned on, he leaned closer and whispered in my ear, "There's a killer in this town." I had just moved here with my family from another state, barely settling in before school started. At 12 years old, I was a shy girl with big glasses, nervous about being the new kid in 7th grade. I didn't have many friends and figured my chances of making any here were slim, especially since everyone else had already formed their friendships. I could tell this boy was also an outsider, too anxious to meet my gaze. "No," I replied, shaking my head slowly, trying to ignore the pit in my stomach. "It's true," he insisted. "He has long, sharp teeth and smells like pee and rotten fish. One of his eyes is missing, just an empty socket." The description made me uneasy as he leaned in even closer, his breath adding to the unpleasant odor. "If he gets you alone, he'll take you somewhere nobody can find you. He'll do things to you." He mimicked a scratching sound on the desk with a pencil, making me shrink in my seat. "When he's had his fun, he'll cut you up and dump you in Stanville Spring. If you don't believe me, I can show you later. You can see the bones if you look closely." Stanville Spring was a lake I'd passed on my way to school, marked by a sign that pointed to a path leading into the dark woods. I later learned it was more of a stagnant swamp filled with wildlife, remnants of its past now isolated from the town's main water source. Suddenly, he jabbed my face with the sharp end of his pencil, and I yelped, drawing the teacher's attention. "Quit playing in the back," she shouted, and the whole class turned to look. My cheeks flushed red. The strange boy moved back, grinning at me. I finally took a good look at him, pale, thin, with long, greasy black hair that hung in strands down his shoulders. A booger dangled from his left nostril, and he wore an oversized green sweater with untied shoelaces. For the rest of the day, he continued to make faces at me, and at lunch, he sat alone, his gaze fixed on me. When it was time to leave school, he was waiting at the door, ready to torment me again. "The killer will get you," he muttered as I walked past. "He loves girls like you. You won't make it home today." Fear coursed through me, making my knees weak. I hesitated at the school door, staring at him with wide eyes. "Creepy cat," he sneered before walking away. Naturally, I followed him, convinced that the killer wouldn't get me if I wasn't alone. He turned around. "Quit following me," he growled, then kept walking. I trailed behind him, feeling an unsettling mix of dread and curiosity. "Want to hear a story?" he asked, a wicked grin spreading across his face. I stared at him blankly, but he took my silence as a yes. As we walked, he began, "A long time ago, there was a really nice teacher named Miss Derry. She taught in our class, but then she married another teacher and had 3 kids who went to our school. One day, they got divorced, and the kids went with the dad. Everyone told her she had to leave the school, and when the new year started, she was gone." He paused for effect. "Guess where she went?" Another school?" I ventured. "Nope. A new job? A different country?" "Wrong again," he said. On the first day of school, a girl noticed a terrible smell coming from the storage room outside the lunch hall, the one with the red door. She opened it and saw Mrs. Derry's dead body hanging from the ceiling. He smiled, watching my eyes widen in horror, clearly relishing the fear he was instilling. I stumbled through the school halls in a daze, my mind racing as we passed the sign for Stanville River. If I hadn't been so focused on his story, I might have followed him all the way home. "I'm going now," I muttered as we neared my house. He ignored me and kept walking, and I bolted inside as soon as I reached the door. "Hey, darling. How was your first day?" my mother greeted me. "Great," I replied, though I was still trembling. I rushed past her and up to my room, curling into a ball on the floor. All I could think about was what I might find if I opened that red door outside the lunch hall, and how someone could die hanging from their neck. The next day, I found myself sitting next to him again. His name was Will, and he continued to make faces at me, but thankfully we had different classes later on. Even when he wasn't around, I couldn't shake the anxiety he'd planted in my mind about the killer and the teacher he'd mentioned. At lunch, I hesitated outside the dreaded storage room, hearing Will's voice behind me. "I dare you to open it." He grinned. "I'll give you $5 if you do." Against my better judgment, I reached for the handle, feeling compelled to follow through. Suddenly, I felt a strong shove from behind, and the door slammed shut, locking me inside. The darkness enveloped me, and the musty smell was overwhelming. I gasped, scrambling for the handle, but it wouldn't budge no matter how hard I tried. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped in a room where someone had hung themselves. I heard something swinging in the dark and, in a moment of terror, I thought I saw a decayed face peering down at me, the noose around its neck. I screamed for help, banging on the door with all my might, but no one came. I continued to yell, convinced my life was in danger, for a solid 10 minutes before the door finally opened. I stumbled out, pale and hyperventilating, landing in the school janitor's arms. "Wow, how'd you get in there?" she asked, surprised. "I got stuck," I managed to say, shaking. "You poor thing," she said, patting my head before leaving. Later, Will greeted me at the school doors, a sinister smile plastered on his face. I wanted to avoid him, but I was now terrified of walking home alone. "That was hilarious," he laughed. "Did you even hear yourself? You sounded like a dying monkey or a dolphin." I frowned, trying to brush it off as we walked. "Did you see a dead body in there?" he taunted. I nodded, and he continued, "Well, you better hope it's not hiding under your bed tonight." I stayed silent, and our days together continued like this. I felt traumatized after the storage room incident, but I was also scared that avoiding Will would make things worse or that the killer would get me if I went home alone. I was stuck with him, and each day, he waited by the school doors to share another horrific story about the random places we passed in town. His tales grew increasingly bizarre and inventive. "See that bridge? A few years ago, it was built wrong. A pregnant woman was walking on it one day, and it snapped. She fell into the river and drowned with her baby. Some kids went camping in that field and never came back. Turns out, one of them was bitten by a rabid wolf and started biting the others. They all died slowly, knowing they were going to die, but couldn't do anything about it." He would occasionally throw in a few gruesome facts, like, if you cut off someone's head, they can still see for a few moments after. Every year, nearly 1 million children are kidnapped. Did you know he made it a point to meet me at the school gate every day? Even when he was sick, he'd be there, feverish and hoarse, walking me home. He'd insist that some teachers were spying on me or tell creepy stories. He wouldn't pass up a single chance to scare me. But eventually, my fear faded, and I began to find his tales amusing. As I got to know the world better, I realized that not everything he said was true. I started exploring the town more, sometimes with my parents or a new friend from math class. Once, I even returned to the red storage room where he'd once locked me. Instead of the horrors I imagined, there were just tools and cleaning supplies. Moving from 7th to 8th grade, I noticed he adjusted his stories to keep me on edge. Now he told bizarre tales, like how one classmate's mom, a butcher, supposedly used special meat in her pies. It became clear that he'd turned into more of a jokester than a menace. One day, as we walked past Stanfield Creek, he asked if I'd ever been down there. That place had always made me uneasy, but I shrugged it off. He rolled his eyes, saying, "Come on, don't tell me you actually believe there are dead bodies there." We kept walking, and he casually confessed that the stories he'd told me the previous year were all fake. When I said I already knew, he looked almost disappointed. On the last day of 8th grade, we both found ourselves in the new student lounge. After a few failed attempts to play a movie, he turned to me, lit by the neon blue screen glow. He looked different from the boy I'd first met, taller, healthier, and somehow more confident. "You know," he started, "why didn't you ever tell anyone I locked you in that storage closet?" I paused, then shrugged. "I don't know. I guess I was afraid of what you'd do if you found out." "Good choice," he muttered, smirking. As we walked home, he started opening up about the origins of his stories. Some were inspired by real people or events. The tale about the teacher who hanged herself was based on a real teacher who had divorced and disappeared. The story of the old woman in the hospital, that was based on his grandmother. And the one about the pregnant woman who fell off a bridge? That came from his mother, who'd left his family years ago. What about the one about the killer at Stanville Spring? I asked. He hesitated, as if he'd forgotten it entirely. Then he laughed. That one? Totally made up. I just wanted to scare you with the worst thing I could think of. Do you honestly believe the adults would let you walk home alone if there was a real killer around? Guess not, I replied, feeling a strange sense of relief as we finally reached my house. It occurred to me that this was our last walk home together. Will, I said firmly. He looked over at me. You have to come to my 14th birthday party this Saturday. I told you about it last year. He sighed, sounding reluctant. I can't. Why not? I just can't. This might be the last time I see you for a while. Can you at least try? I pleaded. He looked down, then away, before finally meeting my gaze again. Fine, he said, offering a rare smile. I'll be there. I ran inside with excitement as he turned and continued down the street. My parents were thrilled I was having my first real birthday party with friends. They'd worried that I might not have any friends at all. Only 4 people were invited, but I was mostly excited to see Will outside of school, for once. But he never showed. I waited all day, and when my friends left, disappointment overwhelmed me. Honey, are you sure he knew it was today? My mom asked gently. Don't take it personally, my dad added, trying to reassure me. But as the evening wore on, my disappointment grew into worry. Will had never failed to walk me home, not once. The certainty in his voice when he promised to come convinced me that something was wrong. I woke up at 2 a.m., drenched in a cold sweat, feeling an irresistible pull to go to Stanville Creek. I didn't know why or what I was looking for. I just felt in my gut that I needed to go. The feeling was too strong to ignore, so I quietly crept past my sleeping parents, grabbed my jacket and a flashlight, and slipped into the empty street. For the first time, I crossed the Stanville Creek, 1.5 miles sign, and ventured into the woods without hesitation. My heart pounded as I ran down the trail, questioning my own actions. Why was I doing this, and why was I so sure I'd find something? I couldn't answer. All I knew was that I had to keep going. When I reached Stanville Creek, I shone my flashlight over the small lake, surrounded by trees. The water was calm, covered in lily pads and algae, reflecting the faint light of the moon and stars. The night was quiet, filled only with my own breathing and the sound of distant crickets. There were no bodies, no blood, just the peaceful silence of nature. I felt relieved, having finally faced my biggest fear. I walked around the edge of the lake, grateful my parents were still asleep and wouldn't scold me for sneaking out. But as I turned to leave, my flashlight caught something unusual by the base of a tree, a large, black suitcase. It looked out of place, abandoned. I stared at it for a moment before unzipping it out of curiosity. Something fell out, a human hand. What happened next is still a blur. My parents told me later that I burst into the house, screaming for them to call the police because there was a body in a suitcase. The police came, and before they even identified the body, I told them it had to be Will. They asked how I knew, but I couldn't explain it. I just knew. It took years for the full story to come out. On the day he promised to come to my party, Will had decided to report years of abuse by his stepfather. But his stepfather had spotted him walking away from home, and they'd gotten into an argument. It's still unclear what happened, but it ended with Will's death. When his stepfather was arrested, he confessed to years of abuse. He was a tall, overweight man with sharp, crooked teeth, one eye hidden by an eye patch due to an old illness. For a long time, I blamed myself. I talked to Will every day, yet I realized how little I truly knew about him. I'd never asked why he couldn't go to other kids' homes or join school trips. I ignored the signs, the way he'd use his stories to cope with the horrors he faced. He walked me home every day, keeping me safe, and then went back to confront his own nightmare alone. I moved to a new town after high school and built a good life. I have 2 kids now, ages 7 and 10. My favorite thing to do is walk them home from school, telling them stories like the ones Will used to tell me. Sometimes I throw in a spooky tale to keep them on their toes, just age-appropriate enough to remind them to be cautious of real dangers in the world. One day, I'll tell them about Will, but that story can wait a while longer.